Hi, today I have with me State Representative Jean Wu from Houston, Texas, representing House District 137. Welcome, Representative Wu.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
So what efforts has Houston or the state of Texas taken to address the COVID-19 pandemic?
I think, initially, I think Houston was spared a lot of the really harsh realities of COVID-19, but with the second wave essentially here, it's become sort of very grim for our area. Our numbers are spiking, and people, I think, are just in a panic. People don't know what to do. I think we have half the population who still thinks this is a joke, and and half the population just trying to do everything they can to stay safe.
So what efforts has Houston or the state of Texas taken to address the COVID-19 pandemic?
I think that's a hard question to answer, because I think the response from the state, controlled by Republicans, and the response of local city officials, local county officials in major metro areas controlled by Democrats has been very starkly different. I think there's been a lot of people at the state level who have treated this as a nothing, as a hoax, and there's people who even to this day, are sort of equivocal about wearing a mask and the other precautions, whereas the response from the major metro areas, like Harris County, has been to immediately order stay-at-home, to issue stay-at-home orders, to issue mask orders, which were then overridden by state officials.
So has economic activity resumed in Houston or in the state of Texas?
Yes and no. So Texas has had the double whammy of being hit by both the COVID shutdown and the oil price crisis, and that's affected our economy, I think, probably more than most places. And oil is coming back up a tiny bit, and that's the number of wells being shut down is slowing. It's still not where it needs to be, and that's very problematic for our state. The regular economy is still down. Restaurants are down. Entertainment places are definitely down, and I'm not sure it's going to get better anytime soon. The number of COVID cases in our area is still rising. It's rising at a slightly slower pace now. We're trying to bend the curve, but we have a long way to go. We don't know where the bottom is.
So what is it going to take to reopen the economy?
I think the sad reality is that either so many people get the virus that we end up having herd immunity, which unfortunately would result in probably millions of deaths, or we're able to hold out until a vaccine is released. The sad reality is, the most unfortunate thing is that we still have a significant portion of the population who do not take this seriously, who do treat it as a joke, and are making efforts to control the spread so much harder.
According to Stop AAPI Hate, there have been over 2,000 incidents of hate incidents against Asian Americans in the wake of COVID-19. What have you seen in Houston? So
that's kind of like hard to, it's very hard to address, because at one point, on one hand, we know that the incidences are happening because we hear about it throughout the community. But on the other hand, because Houston is a more recent immigrant community, it's a place where a lot of immigrants and a lot of Asian community members are afraid to speak up, afraid to even call the police when things happen. But they'll tell their friend, who then tells another friend, who then tells another friend, and then eventually reaches us. So we hear about incidences, but when we check with the police, when we check with other people, they aren't popping up. And that has been one of my big concerns, is that that this is causing a problem for the community, but we're unable to address it because the community is so fearful, because not only of the natural tendency of immigrant communities to fear authority, fear the government, fear the police, but I think the Trump administration, because of their attacks on immigrant communities, because of their attacks on Asian communities, that people don't feel like they're going to be safe reporting things.
Worldwide, people have seen the death of George Floyd and the resulting protests. How has Houston reacted, particularly given that he was raised there?
Yeah, so the tragedy and the murder of George Floyd has been a very difficult thing here. And this was George Floyd's home. There's a lot of people here who remember him, and he has family members here. And we had his final funeral here that was attended even by Governor Abbott. And, you know, in response to this tragedy, you know, our city, which is typically a very, very calm, very low-key place, we had a march of over 65,000 people of all walks of life, of all races, of all backgrounds. And it's not just George Floyd. I think the frustration here and the frustration everywhere is with the sort of like the final realization, the unraveling of this facade, that there is tremendous systematic racism throughout the nation, and throughout our government, throughout our society. And I think people have just had it, and people are angry, and rightfully so. And I don't think that people in Houston are any less or more angry than any other place in America. I think this is a nationwide issue that must be addressed.
And what about the local AAPI community in Houston? How have they reacted?
So I want to be completely brutally honest, and the answer is probably going to be it's been a little bit mixed, but much better than I expected, and a lot better than I feared. And you know, traditionally and historically, Asian Americans have not had a great relationship with the African American community, but because of the national attention, because of I think is the sort of final unraveling, because of the amount of attention being paid to what's going on, we've had a tremendous outpouring of support for Black Lives Matter, for social justice reform, for criminal justice reform, from across the APIA community. And you know, I think for the first time, Asian Americans are finally seeing the hate and the racism that's coming from the Trump administration and realizing for what it's worth. I think, you know, for the modern history of Asian Americans in the United States, we have sort of been treated with, you know, what we call the myth of the model minority, that, oh, those Asians, they're the good ones. They never complain about anything. You don't see them out in the street like the Black people, who are always demanding their rights. Asians are just so quiet. They just work so hard and they keep their mouth shut. And I think Asian Americans are really realizing, hey, that's not right. That's not a good thing. And I think on one hand, you still have community members who feel like they need to keep their mouth shut. They want to stay in that model minority seat. But for a lot of the rest of the community, even people that you wouldn't expect, they're coming out and saying, like, you know what happened to George Floyd is wrong. What's happening to Black people across this nation is wrong. We can't stand for it. And we can no more stand for that than we can stand Trump calling it the Kung flu or the Wuhan virus or the Chinese virus and blaming Asian Americans for what happens in other parts of the world.
Thank you for sharing that. The current COVID-19 pandemic and BLM movement has changed the state of the world drastically. What do you think is required of the United States and of the world going forward?
I think the first step in addressing all problems is to recognize that there is a problem. And even that is not a done deal. I think you still have a lot of people who, even watching George Floyd slowly being murdered, for 8.5 minutes. And looking back and looking at what happened to Breonna Taylor and everyone else, there's still people in complete denial. And this is not just true for the United States, but this is true around the world. There's the people in power do not want to recognize that there is injustice, there is racism, and there's inequality while they have been in power. And this is something that needs to be addressed, but it's not about our leaders, it's about our people. The communities of the United States need to get together and recognize that they have more in common than they have that divides them. And this isn't especially true for the Asian American community. And I think, going back to what we talked about, the myth of model minority is what's been foisted on the Asian American community is we've been told, you don't need to be like the other minorities. You don't need to be loud and be obnoxious and protest and demand rights. Just be good little workers and just stay in your place. And a lot of our community members have resonated with that. That makes sense to them because, where they come from in China, in Korea, and in India and other places, they were told the same thing. But this is America. America is about speaking up. You don't get anything if you don't make a lot of noise. And what I want is for our community and for the rest of the United States to recognize that there is racism in this country. There is very objective and clear, open racism. And sometimes it doesn't have to be someone being murdered on the street. Sometimes it doesn't have to be white men hunting down a Black teenager and shooting him in the street. It doesn't have to be any number of things. It doesn't have to be just Vincent Chen. But it happens throughout our society, and we must recognize it. And I think the more that the Asian American community recognizes what happens with the Hispanic community, and the Hispanic community recognizes what happens with the African American community, and the African community recognizes what happens with the GLBT community, and so on and so forth, the more we can understand each other, the more we recognize each other's pain and suffering, the more we can become united and fight the same hate all throughout.
Looking forward, what are the challenges you see for the 2021 legislative session in Texas?
For us in the Texas legislature, the biggest answer, and there's some people who want to say the budget and stuff. No, budgets come and go. The biggest problem for the legislature is going to be redistricting. And because this is a turning point for the state. Back a few years ago, just even a year ago, when I would tell my colleagues, my Republican colleagues, hey, the state's turning blue. You guys need to shape up and stop doing all the crazy stuff. And they literally laughed in my face. And now, after 4 years of Trump, we're about to see the state flip blue. And what happens in 2021 is going to determine the future of the state, not only for the next 10 years, but probably for the next 50 years, because the state is at a crossroads. We are at a place where even after severe gerrymandering, Republicans are losing control. The white majority of the state is losing control, and Hispanic population, African American population, Asian population are rising throughout the state, and they're going to demand a voice. And once we have a voice, we're going to be able to say who gets what districts, how are maps drawn, are you going to split our communities up anymore? And I think the answer is going to be no. We're going to be in charge of this. And so if 2021, if we're able to even get remotely fair maps, I think Democrats and the minority communities, including Asian American communities, are going to see a big change in who represents them and how they're treated in the government.
And what about you? What bills or initiatives are you planning to move forward?
So I'm just a little nobody state rep out of Houston. But my big priorities have always been dealing with children. I've worked on a lot of child protective services issues, child abuse issues, and things like that. And we're going to continue on that and focus on something that we've sort of let fall by the wayside, which is juvenile justice reform. And along with that, we're going to work on a lot of adult criminal justice reform, including prison reforms, including reforms of the drug war. The one silver lining of COVID-19 that I can think of is that my dreams of what we can do to make our society better, that I thought once were pipe dreams, that once would take 20 years to accomplish, I think are possible next session, including dramatically limiting how much prison time someone could be sentenced to for having a drug addiction. And we have people who are serving life sentences right now, life sentences for drug possession, for drug addiction. And that is simply outrageous. It is a tremendous waste of taxpayer resources. And it is bad for our society, it's bad for our communities. And I want to work on that. I want to fix those things. Let's not treat nonviolent people who have mental health issues, who have behavioral issues, who have substance abuse issues, like we treat violent criminals. Let's treat them differently. Let's save money for our community. Let's do things better that don't destroy entire communities.
Great. Well, best of luck, and thank you for sharing with us today.
Absolutely.